Thank you, Daniel. And thank all of you for showing up here this evening and braving the weather. I'm personally excited to be here, not because this is just an exciting topic, but because I grew up about 3 hours drive north of here on I-29 in southwestern Iowa. And so growing up, going to Kansas City was going to the big city to go see Royals games or to go to the museums, or perhaps most importantly for a 12-year-old Worlds of Fun. But it's great to be back here in Kansas City and great to talk about this topic. When we first went to the moon back in the 1960s, the United States was pretty much on its own. The only other major space power at the time was our arch rival, the Soviet Union. We were engaged in a Cold War-driven space race with them, vying for a series of firsts leading up to the first humans to walk on the moon in 1969. International cooperation was very limited then. But even as far back as 50 years ago, there were signs of growing international cooperation in space. 50 years ago this summer, July of 1975, an Apollo spacecraft launched from the US, docked with a Soyuz spacecraft launched from the Soviet Union in orbit. The first time that the crews from the two countries had met in space. This was called in the US the Apollo-Soyuz Test Project because this was a one-time effort to demonstrate this cooperation. Not surprisingly, in the Soviet Union, it was called the Soviet Apollo program. But also 50 years ago, this summer, a group of about 12 Western European nations decided that it was better for them to cooperate with each other on their space programs than work independently. And so they joined forces and created what's called the European Space Agency, which continues to this day, and it's in fact one of the largest space agencies in the world and a frequent partner with NASA and other space agencies. Now fast forward to today, and we see that as we are planning to return to the moon with the Artemis program, the situation is very different. There are now dozens of countries with space programs and a growing array of space capabilities. Building satellites, launching satellites, operating satellites, in some cases being able to send people into space. We are also seeing a flourishing space economy with companies in the United States and other countries developing capabilities that were once in the realm of just a handful of governments. So today, what does that mean for international cooperation in space? What can this growing array of countries do in space together that they may not be able to do individually or may not be able to do as effectively individually? And so we have a great panel here to talk about this topic. How can countries work together? Why do countries want to work together in space in the first place? What are the benefits of doing so? But also, what are some of the challenges associated with doing it as well? And so I'm going to briefly introduce our three panelists and have them come up on the stage, and then we're going to sit down and have a nice discussion, and we'll save about 10 or 15 minutes towards the end for questions from you in the audience. So first is Patrick Finley. Patrick is Director of the Human Exploration and Operations Division in the Office of International and Interagency Relations at NASA, quite the job title, where he works to support current and future civil space cooperation between the United States and countries around the world, particularly in the area of human spaceflight. He has a master's in security policy studies from George Washington University's Elliott School and a bachelor's degree in history from Missouri State University. And perhaps most importantly from this audience, he's a Kansas City native. So Patrick. Kelly Kettis-Ogborn is Vice President of Space Commerce and Entrepreneurship at the Space Foundation. She leads the Space Commerce Institute, an initiative aimed at providing valuable insights and actionable programming for companies, individuals, and organizations to carve out their own niche and their share of the thriving space economy. She has played a pivotal role in shaping the trajectory of companies entering the space market. And as we know, that includes not just companies here in the US, but in countries around the world. Kelly, come on up. And finally, last but certainly not least, Sadia Pekkanen. She is the Job and Gertrude Tamaki Endowed Professor at the University of Washington, where she works in the intersection of, international relations and international law, particularly involving the commercial, legal, and security policies regarding space affairs. She's also an adjunct professor in the Department of Political Science at the University of Washington, as well as an adjunct professor in the School of Law. And she's involved with a couple of organizations within the university, including the Space Law Data and Policy Program in the School of Law, and the founding co-director of the Space Policy Research Center, or SPARC, at the university. So Sadia. So now we've established we've got a great panel of experts here. I want to start off with you, Patrick. We know that NASA is involved in a lot of international projects. I think a lot of people in the room are familiar with, for example, the International Space Station, which obviously is a program that includes not just the US, but Canada, Japan, Europe, and Russia. Can you give us a little sense of sort of the breadth and depth of international cooperation at NASA today?
Yeah, well, sure. Well, thank you. Thanks for the kind introduction from all involved, and I am really pleased to be here. Thank you all for coming, especially with this lovely weather we're having. But yeah, it's a fantastic question. You hit on a little bit of the breadth in terms of its history. NASA's really had international cooperation really since the start of the space program, even going back to Apollo, where you had deep space communication sites based in Australia, for example, to help us communicate with the crews. And so really, as we move forward into a more modern era, you hit on, the International Space Station, the international cooperation associated with that. As we kind of look and focus on human spaceflight going forward, we're focused on the moon, and of course we're focused on Mars as well. And we really view those international partnerships as really critical, as enabling us to help us achieve the objectives that we have, and some of the countries and space agencies around the world also sort of share. But it really does run through so much. We have something like 700 current international agreements at NASA, and it spans everything. My focus is human spaceflight. Those are really large, kind of complex programs. But the reality is, as they always say, the first A in NASA is aeronautics. So we have work going on in aeronautics, we have work going on in robotic science, we have work going on really magnificent kind of complex projects, and also really, really low barriers to entry where maybe a sensor that somebody's housing or placing on a site here at a university or a school that allows us to collect aerosol data from around the world. So we really have an amazing range, an amazing scale of cooperation, and because the planet is so linked, as we were talking just before we came on here, by the science and technology that we all are engaged in here in space. We do have a really large, sort of vast set of international partnerships at NASA. So I hope that kind of paints the picture a little bit, at least, to get us started.
Yeah, I think that number, that 700 or so, is absolutely stunning, because you hear only about a few, but now you realize just how much NASA is working with other agencies. Sadia, when we provide sort of the international perspective, particularly, I know you focus a lot on Asia. What are views in terms of international cooperation, either with the United States or with other countries in space?
Yeah. So first of all, I'm so pleased to be here. Thank you to the Linda Hall Library and the International Relations Council for helping put this together. I think that we are at a very important moment historically in terms of what we think of as the new space age. And as Jeff was saying in his opening remarks, this is an age in which the United States alone is not the only country that is shaping cooperation in space. There are also other countries that are shaping cooperation in space as well. And because I focus on Asia, one of the leading powers in Asia, China, is also very strongly interested in shaping the cooperation landscape with respect to space. So what we are beginning to see emerge is sort of a US-led block of cooperation regarding space, which is based on things like the Artemis Accords from NASA. And then we're also beginning to see sort of a China-led block, which is focused on establishing an outpost on the moon. It has its own space station, and it's also gathering together the countries within what is called the Global South to be involved in their programs and technologies. So I think that that's where we are, sort of at the international level. In terms of cooperation, right now we don't see a lot of cooperation between the US and China for a number of reasons, but we certainly are beginning to see sort of a two-block movement going forward in this new space age. It's very different from where it was just the US and the Soviet Union, because again, as Jeff was pointing out, there are many countries that are also involved on one side or the other. But there's no question that the US is leading and that China is leading as well. So that's how I would sort of describe the general context for international relations today for space.
Kelly, we're now living in an era where we have companies that have capabilities that usually were once reserved for countries, for governments. How is that shaping international cooperation? What are the roles companies are increasingly playing in working together with other countries?
Yeah, that's a great point. And thank you again for having us. We're really, it's an honor to be here. I think from the commercial perspective and the company perspective, it's a good place to frame it how you started about talking how engagement with space even began with the Apollo era. Because at that time, as you mentioned, it was two nations, the United States and the USSR, and really the way that things were engaged is it was national priority at the top, national funding directive down, so everything was vertically integrated. In this new environment that we're engaging with the Artemis program and beyond, it's very international, it's very desegregated, it's very, it needs to be collaborative and competitive at the same time, I think is the best. And so where we're pushing for in this future eventuality is not just going to be led by one country and it's not going to be led by one company, but it's going to be very integrated. And so what we are starting to see is that a lot of these commercial capabilities are really coming online and creating this backbone of how governments can utilize them and in what part of the value chain, which is extremely interesting. I think part of the opportunity and the challenges there is that for a lot of these commercial companies, it comes into the ecosystem of how to actually engage with these countries and where it might trip them up. So I'm sure we'll get into this pretty quickly, but space started with friends and foes. There's still very much friends and foes as exist now. And so for a lot of companies that might want to engage, it may be an easier environment to engage with China. However, that will completely prevent them from doing business with the US down the road. And so a lot of these considerations are really critical in their calculus and how to actually engage in space and who they engage with.
I'm thinking along those lines, and something that actually just happened today is we had a private spacecraft, Crew Dragon spacecraft, dock with the space station. It's a private mission, but 3 of the astronauts on board are from government agencies, one from Hungary, one from India, and one from Poland. Is that sort of the model for what the future of international cooperation might look like with the commercial component?
I think it can. I mean, that certainly is a fantastic example because it not only shows the nationalistic pride that each astronaut brings to space, bearing their flag, but also the collective unity of what we're pushing. I think that is very much one critical aspect. I think another one is really going to come from how a lot of the integration of technologies, capabilities, and data sharing actually evolves, because with the utilization of assets in space, like satellites, for example, how they're then integrated and what the regulatory framework looks like for them to actually use the technology and use the capabilities, I think is one piece. One of the ways that I do think that they will really be able to shape the engagement is through a lot of the partnerships with the emerging nations and spacefaring nations on bringing a lot of their commercial capabilities into these bigger projects. And something like that, I think, is less visible than like an Axiom mission, but is a bit more tangible in shaping the future.
Yeah. Did you?
No, I just wanted to piggyback off of something that Kelly is putting on the table. One of the things that we know about what China is doing, for example, there's something called the Belt and Road Initiative, which is really about setting up commercial infrastructures across land and across sea. And what most people don't realize is that there's also a space information corridor that is associated with this, and we sort of begin to think of this as the digital space road, for example, the space information corridor. And central to this is something called the Beidou, which is China's GPS, if you will. And the more that they can sort of help integrate that into the the actual realities on the ground for countries around the world that are interested in part of being Beidou and the Space Information Corridor, they are definitely ahead of that. So in that sense, I think the United States, we're sort of focused on the Artemis, of course, but there's also this other element that I think that we need to be thinking about for our commercial companies and also for our diplomacy writ large going forward.
All right. Patrick, you mentioned the 700 or so cooperative agreements. When NASA approaches a country, or when a country approaches NASA about a potential partnership, how does NASA gauge what is NASA looking for in terms of the benefits of such a partnership? Is it technical? Is it cost sharing? Is it more policy related? What are you sort of looking for in a partnership benefit?
We just gave a brilliant answer because it's all those things. But no, that's exactly right. So NASA was founded in 1958. There's legislation that really very clearly lays out our role and our objective, which is great. So the principal role of what we're trying to do as a space agency, expand human knowledge. It's written pretty directly there. Advance the state of the art and technology in aerospace and aeronautics. And so when we talk about or formulate or consider the potential for international partnerships, that's front of mind. What are we doing to either unlock sort of a robotic mission, something we don't know about our environment or our neighborhood here in space, or do we have a particular technical mission, like in the human space side, that space flight side, that we're trying to achieve that could be enhanced by international partners? Because international partnerships can and certainly should bring additional resources to an issue. So you've got a very risky prospect, which is to say putting anything in space, but certainly the fragile humans that we are, putting them in this austere space environment. And so anything that we can do to make our systems more effective, more safe, more reliable is an enhancement. And so again, this is a resource issue, and a lot of people, when they think about that, it's purely financial resources. But the reality is, it's about people as well. This painting hangs in my office. So that's the handshake in space between General Tom Stafford and the Soviet general, his name is Alexei Leonov. They both passed away. But what they represented was the ability to tap into working together to solve a problem that individually they couldn't solve on their own. The understanding, you mentioned this mission took place in 1975, but the rationale for why it came about was because we realized that having two independent human spaceflight capabilities, while interesting, fascinating, and certainly focused on competition, what happens if you're stranded? What happens if you have a problem? What happens if a national hero, the pride and the cream of the crop, of which there are many from Missouri and Kansas that are astronauts, but what happens if you're up there and you're in distress and you can't be rescued? Well, this was the answer. Interoperability, working together, enhancing the mission, making sure that our astronauts and cosmonauts, who are really ambassadors for humanity, are never left in that kind of situation. So I think it's a great example of it. And so whether it's laboratories, whether it's scientists who are specialists from around the world, being able to really tap into the human and financial resources, technical resources from around the world, really gives us an opportunity to enhance our capabilities and meet our objectives, which again was really clearly put on the table for us by our leaders in Congress and the White House. So it really makes it a pretty straightforward mission for us.
Yeah. When it comes to the diplomatic elements of cooperation in space, is space sort of an area that can be sort of open the door to broader cooperation with countries, or is it something that sort of comes as part of the other political processes?
You're looking at me.
Anyone.
So I think we're at a very interesting moment historically. Of course, there is a lot of tension, but I want to build off of what Patrick is saying, is that at the end of the day, we have billionaires who are talking about millions of people living and working in space. That's the kind of dream that we want to move towards. If we all sort of keep that human element in mind, then perhaps an area for potential collaboration is to sort of think about the low-hanging fruit of How do you protect astronauts and passengers in space? How do you build the medical, the health, the biological environment around them so that we can sustain life in space? So yes, of course, it's very challenging, particularly for the US and China to sort of come together. But I think if we keep the emphasis on the health, well-being of human beings in space, that is at least the lowest common denominator that we can all agree that we should be working towards. Unfortunately, the international space law regime that we have in place does talk very little about health. It does certainly talk about rescue of astronauts and so on. So that's some place where we can perhaps begin to build a platform for thinking about how we might come together. And that's also an area where I think not just the leading spacefaring countries, but also emerging spacefaring countries might potentially be able to come together and think about how to safeguard human life in space. So, Patrick, more work for you to do.
Sure.
Kelly, as companies get involved in international cooperation, are they looking for just new markets to expand to, or are there other benefits from working with other countries?
I think there's a lot of benefits, and I'll roll that into following up on what you said. I think diplomacy in space is sort of part and parcel of how we engage, right? It's how we began. It's very difficult to not have some sort of diplomatic, even soft power element, because there are so many countries sort of engaging. I think just some defining aspects that might be important for the audience before I answer your question is to define actually what like a commercial company actually is. Because a lot of people, when they think about space engagement, they think it is kind of this completely separate ecosystem, but commercial companies are still primarily extremely reliant on governments as customers. And so governments, whether it's the United States government or governments around the world, are really these anchor customers to not only procure goods and services, but also give signals about where they might want tech development or scientific progression to go. And so there's always going to be an element of who you engage and how you engage. I think from a commercial aspect, one thing that's really interesting, and it gets to your point about how they can benefit nations, is when you think of like commercial capabilities coming into the space domain, they're no longer just economic assets, but they really are geopolitical and diplomacy tools. Because the nations that are developing commercial capabilities that might lead in satellite communication or launch capabilities really have an opportunity to influence the way that the world connects and how they monitor assets. And then in turn, a lot of these commercial companies are really setting the standards and creating the norms of behavior and creating kind of operational norms in orbit, which those norms generally will take on the values and priorities of the nation that you represent. And so I think as a diplomatic tool, these commercial companies are sort of an extension of that. I think when they're looking to engage, it partially does come to market value, but there also is a distinction of who you want to engage with and not. I think the framework you're talking about, like the Artemis Accords, which is a treaty led by, well, it's not led by NASA, but very much participation, where I think as of late there's 55 nations that have signed on, and it's really, collective standards of how you want to behave. China also has one, the ILRS, which I think has 13. There's only one country that overlaps, Thailand. And so for these, it really is sort of this ideal of how you want to collectively engage and what sort of capabilities you want to bring to bear. And for commercial companies, they do need to consider that, because it would be very difficult to do business with any of the Artemis signatories if they are doing business with ILRS. And so those are kind of calculuses that they bring to bear as much as just making money and sort of economic return.
Yeah. Patrick, since the issue of the Artemis Accords came up, I'm curious, maybe you can provide sort of a little overview of how that came about and what the value of that is. Because it's not just, countries saying that they want to participate in Artemis. It's about actually best practices for space operations and things like that.
Yeah, I'm glad you asked the question. I'm glad Kelly brought it up as well. There's a person I used to work for, used to say that when we launch our spacecraft or our people into orbit, we we launch our values along with them. So I couldn't agree more with what Kelly was saying. And so the Artemis Accords, really did come about as a way, principally, first of all, it's the U.S. State Department and NASA working together in partnership. So you have our diplomats and our technical specialists at NASA, which so inevitably are inexorably linked, that space technology and diplomatic aspect in that activity. But you have an intent in the drafting of it, and I encourage anybody to Google it. They're welcome to read it. It's actually fairly short. I think there's even a very flashy website. But it really is just a reassertion of the commitments that our government had already made as part of the 1967 Outer Space Treaty. And it's really trying to provide clarity about what are our values, what are the things that we want to insist upon and also demonstrate as we continue to have increased activity, both government and commercial activity, and as we go to the moon and beyond. And so really, these are principles. These are principles that we've asserted are so important. Non-interference, so we don't land near another country or company's site or its spacecraft and do anything untoward that would interfere with its mission. And we'd expect the same in return, of course. Transparency, so that you can make sure that you understand, you state your intentions and what their purposes are, so that there's not a confusion that leads to a cascade effect of interference or interaction that could lead to a conflict. So these are important principles that we bring forward. Now they're not the Artemis Accords are not a program themselves. They're not a rocket. They're not a spacecraft. But it's meant to pervade every single thing we do. And in fact, when we conclude international agreements with partner space agencies, we describe particularly our subscription to the Artemis Accords and the principles therein as part of this, because we want to make sure that we're very upfront and very direct about it, that we want to carry this forward. And this was, I didn't actually answer it when you asked me earlier, but this is really that kind of third leg in the stool, right? It's our diplomatic or soft power sort of impact at NASA when we do international missions or collaboration anyway. When we have an opportunity to, as I say, bring our values with us into space or into orbit, it's with our commercial partners. Like we can't, you talked about the reliance that maybe the commercial industry has on government contracts, but certainly the technical capabilities that they enable are the only way in which we're able to achieve our mission. And so seeing a vibrant, successful commercial space industry has an absolute direct impact on the government's ability to execute its missions. But I would also say that along the way, things like open and free access to scientific data, these are important principles for our scientific community, for the scientific communities and allied partners and nations. And so it's not necessarily the case all over the world. So our promotion of these principles, our insistence on it when we partner with other countries is really provided us a way to what I like to think of as really do a lot of influence through the actions that we take. And so I just think that's an important part of what we're trying to accomplish that has impacts, hopefully positive impacts for industry, academia, the scientific and research community, as well as, of course, those enhancements to being able to achieve our technical objectives as well.
Sadia, we know that there's this Chinese equivalent, the International Lunar Research Station, is in its own principles. Is it similar? Is it different in ways? What do we know about what China is thinking in terms of these same concepts?
Yeah, so China is, of course, a signatory to the Outer Space Treaty. This is our treaty from 1967 that is really the foundational building block treaty for all of international space law. And it has the principles that Patrick was just talking about, free and peaceful exploration of space, civilian exploration, cooperation, protection, and no harmful interference. So China, of course, to say that they agree with the values that the U.S. is sort of making more concrete in the Artemis Accords, they've certainly signed up to those same principles in the context of the Outer Space Treaty. But what we don't know very well is the MOU that has been signed and the bilateral agreements that have been executed, the MOUs that China has signed, I think with about now 13 participant, we don't know what the basis of those agreements might be. So at one level, it's not completely transparent what it is that they're basing this cooperation on. But if we step away from principles and we just think it purely in terms of politics and alignment, then the issue is that we do see certain countries gravitating towards what China wants to do in terms of utilizing its space station. It also has a space station in orbit, and what it wants to do on the moon. So at the end of the day, it might very well be that they have the same sort of aspirational and legal and normative goals. They're just executing it through very different types of approaches. On the US, it's fairly clear what the Artemis Accords, how the Outer Space Treaty has been interpreted. We're not completely sure in terms of how the Chinese government has interpreted it, but it's hard to believe that they would not be interpreting it consistent with the Outer Space Treaty because they think that it's important to upholding international space cooperation. So I think that that's the way that I would describe that landscape now. Yeah.
Great. We've talked a lot about the various benefits of international cooperation. In any endeavor like this, there's going to be some challenges.
Oh, yes.
Patrick, in NASA's experience, what sort of challenges has NASA run into when trying to work with other countries in space and projects, and how has the agency resolved them, assuming that you were able to resolve them?
Yeah, that's great. I'd suppose we're all very lucky today. We live in a pretty interconnected world, and I hope people here in the audience have a chance to travel abroad, see what's going on in the rest of the world. It's a really informative experience. But of course, if you may have noticed that sometimes there are certainly cultural differences between different countries. There's even cultural differences between different organizations. So like NASA may have a very different sort of culture than, say, industry or other departments or organizations, or scientists and engineers might have differences. So really, I think when you start to bring together people from groups that aren't used to working with each other, of course, any number of things could kind of pop up. The International Space Station, we signed the agreements in 1998. We started flying our astronauts continuously in 2000. So 25 years uninterrupted presence. But the reality is that wasn't, our first gambit on international cooperation in human spaceflight. It really did start. It took a long time. This mission, again, that's on screen, took a long time to come together. And I know that the way I know, because I happen to know the people who are involved in it, I know how difficult it was to kind of first come together, understand what was really important to your partner, understand what your mission is and what you're trying to accomplish. And everything goes great when you can agree. What about those times when you don't, or if you have a difference of opinion? And so really, part of my job is to really work on the engagements between the space agencies. We communicate constantly. We spend as much time trying to understand what it is we need and how to communicate that to our partners, and likewise what it is that they need and how we can help them accomplish it, because it's really through this mutual benefit that we've seen the most success on some of these missions. Our partners on international missions, everybody ends up being supportive of each other. But if I may, just 1 second longer, the folks who work at NASA, people who work at NASA, are remarkable humans. It's really an honor just to be able to sit up here and talk about the missions that they execute, but that it's a great thing to be a part of. People that I know really well were up and busy very early this morning, right? Because you guys referenced this mission. So the Axiom 4 mission, a commercially led human spaceflight mission launched from Florida, from Kennedy Space Center there, docked with the International Space Station today. As Jeff mentioned, the commander, who you didn't mention, of course, was Peggy Whitson, former NASA astronaut, a really remarkable person in her own right. But her crew members, exactly, Hungarian, Polish, and Indian astronauts. Those are relationships, government relationships with whom we haven't had as much experience or exposure. And so as we continue to have incredible ambitions and go forward into more complex and difficult challenges in human space exploration in particular, we're really looking forward to building those new relationships, but those relationships, those things that allow us to fall back and rely on our partners, either from a technical perspective when we have challenges or to enhance the missions that we envision, that really comes from that really steady investment and engagement and building those relationships. So it's not for when things go well and everything's happening in a great way. It's for when we're really struggling or we have a tough technical issue that we're working through, and then we have those relationships we can fall back on and communicate. So that's what I would say.
Yeah. Kelly, what are some of the challenges companies run into in international cooperation? Are they similar? Are they different?
Different, but I think it stems from some of the same problems. I would say probably two of the ones that come to mind is enabling access and then the regulatory framework. So I'll give you an example about the enabling access piece. I think part of the benefit of the United States space program is that we've been around the longest, right? And we have this established structure. It also makes it very cumbersome to do business with us. And so to your point earlier about other nations, particularly China, being a lot more aggressive in enabling access for companies, I, particularly a couple of years ago, was at a half-day workshop that essentially had the African space delegation and representatives from different US entities, and a lot of these companies in these countries were like, we want to do business with the US, but you're very difficult to do business with because of your landscape. Meanwhile, China is going into their country and giving them a satellite, and they're like, we'll launch you on Saturday. So part of the problem with that is that it would be very hard to then ask those companies or those payloads, right, those commercial payloads, to tell them, hey, wait 5 or 7 years until there's an opportunity for you. Because if you look at the landscape now, there's over 92 countries that have an active satellite in orbit. So beyond getting access to space to do the things you want to do, posturing and having your flag up there, right, and being representative is really important. So that's a critical piece, is just being able to move quickly in the way we want to, but also not degrading our values, not degrading our system, being cautious with what we've built and who we integrate into it, I think is a hard part for some of these companies broadly that want to engage with our value chain and supply chain, but it's just difficult to. I think on the other side, the regulatory framework, what actually really astounded me a couple years ago, I work a lot with the Italians, and even understanding that some of these historic allies of the United States, I mean, Italy is responsible for building 40% of the International Space Station, right? So they've been in space an ally to the United States for a very long time. But when you get their commercial companies and the US commercial companies in integrated architecture, even data sharing, right, amongst these systems and trust in this architecture is a huge problem. And so now that we are engaging space in a way that we have never done before, at the frequency and the ubiquitous volume, addressing some of those challenges to allow more of our historic allies to extend those, privileges to the commercial companies to engage more thoughtfully is a really big problem that needs to be addressed.
And can I add something
Absolutely.
to what Kelly has put on the table? One of the things I track is commercial space diplomacy around the world. So I want to give you 2 concrete examples of how, aside from our focus on the International Space Station and the axioms and the orbital reefs, there's also another whole landscape that's emerging about how private companies, for example, like SpaceX and Starlink, are engaging. So very recently, because I think what they realize is that there's a whole world out there. They can engage markets that are outside of the United States. They can engage partners outside of the United States. And sometimes the US government puts so many roadblocks in their way that they need to find different pathways to move forward. So very recently, Starlink decided that one of its pathways in South Africa was going to be through, they're facing some regulatory hurdles about entry in South Africa for a number of reasons. But what they decided was that they were going to link their Starlink program as an educational pathway that would allow kids in rural areas to also benefit from Starlink. And so that might smooth the process forward, but that also shows you how countries might engage in some sort of commercial space diplomacy, because well, they're in it to make a profit, but this is a pathway through which they can also do it. Now, of course, Starlink is not the only player that's doing this. The player on China side that I recently found out is a company called Star Vision. I think it's a company, but they are interested in building an AI centered network of satellites, and they have begun also educational programs for Kenyan students that take place in Chinese classrooms in China. So I find myself thinking as an academic, gosh, this is a very interesting pathway using education and the way that we sort of think about education to sort of raise people's awareness and young people's awareness about what is possible in the space field. It's good for the companies, it could be good for your government, it could be good for public-private partnerships, but that's a pathway that I think we need to track and monitor very, very closely. I think it's very exciting, actually, to kind of think about it, because it opens up a whole diplomatic front that perhaps we need to think about more seriously, particularly if we are interested in ensuring that our own US companies are positioned to sort of take advantage and have access to worldwide markets. And of course, as we know, Africa launched an African Space Agency. It's headquartered in Egypt, and that continent also represents an opportunity for our commercial space companies going forward.
Yeah. Maybe to build on that a little bit, do other countries still see the United States as sort of the partner of choice for space projects? Or is that, as we go through some of our own challenges like budget cuts and so on, is that potentially changing?
A very good question. I would love to hear also from Patrick and Kelly about what they're seeing from their own purchase. Let me tell you what we see from our international relations community and international security community perspectives. I keep saying that we're at a very interesting moment in history, and countries today have choices. They don't necessarily have to align with the United States. They don't necessarily have to align with China. And because of that, potential turmoil or the political, what they see as political dysfunction in the United States, America has become less attractive, potentially as a stable partner going forward. And I think it's up to the US government, particularly if you're interested in sort of ensuring that our allies or anybody that we're bringing to the table remains, sort of within our own camp, so to speak. We need to be able to stabilize things. Now, having said that, I wouldn't say that, of course, there are also issues with respect to China, and there may be domestic concerns about China. But the game is not, as I said, just between the US and China. It's about how other countries are positioning to take advantage of what the US and China are offering. And for most countries, spread across the developing, emerging countries, what they're interested in is socioeconomic development. They want to leverage space for their own socioeconomic benefits. So whoever allows them to harness that ability is going to sort of get further ahead, in my opinion. And you mentioned Thailand. I mean, Thailand is a very interesting example of what we think of as security hybridization. On the one side, you're with the US. On the other side, you're also with China.
Yeah.
Well, how should then the United States be positioning when that reality is sort of going forward?
Yeah, and they're much better positioned to speak on the government side. I'll just speak on the international company side. So you mentioned the cultural differences, right, amongst countries, and I think that from a space environment, there are still, within other countries, they do not have the innovation, entrepreneurial, capital formation ecosystem that we have in the United States. So when I work with a lot of these countries, their companies want to come to the US to create subsidiaries and get into our value chain because we can move capital quicker. We have a fail fast, fail hard, learn quick, rebuild and pivot mentality, which a lot of other countries don't. And so that is still very attractive, not just for the fact that we have kind of the largest and most established space ecosystem, but that culture on top of that would allow them to build more of their business acumen and technology at a much quicker pace is still an attractive area for them.
Yeah. From my perspective, we absolutely hear and we talk to as many space agencies around the world as we can about their interests and collaboration, so we can look for these opportunities. There is, I would say, sustained and significant interest in the United States and in NASA's leadership. Now, leadership's a word I think that sometimes is used or maybe overused in sort of a nebulous fashion, but it really has a specific, tangible aspect to it as well. When we talked earlier about the benefits of international cooperation, or the purpose of cooperating internationally, those are the benefits that we're trying to realize. But to be clear, the people for whom we're trying to realize these benefits, they're sitting in this room. Mm-hmm. They're sitting here in our country. And so one of the things that I think is so important, and I take with me, and why I'm so proud to be from this area, but from our country, is because when we work on these projects, we really want to deliver benefits. Mm-hmm. And it's exactly what Kelly was saying. One of the most attractive things about working with the United States is, of course, our longstanding expertise. But the reason that we have that expertise is because of the vision that we put out, going all the way back to the foundation of our program. It's the educational institutions that generated engineers and scientists, and then it's our commercial industry, of course, that have all the aspects that Kelly, far more eloquently than I ever could, expressed to you just a moment ago. And I'd really like to, kind of break it down there and just talk about how, I have a history major, so obviously a natural selection for NASA. But the point there is that, the access to space piece is really critical. We have magnificent machines enabling, robotic and human exploration. I mean, they're just glorious. I mean, they're enormous in scale. They're very complex. But the people, none of those machines exist without people. And I'm mm-hmm. talking like exquisite machines, but they come down to really precise engineering, design on computers, really intelligent. But I'm talking touch labor as well. People who are doing fabrication, people who are doing manufacturing. That work is done here. It's done in this community, by the way, as well. There's a lot of the supply chain that is really based here, and I don't know that people in this area know that as much. Like, for example, I wasn't as familiar with it before I got interested in space as well. There are companies like in Joplin, Missouri. There's a company called Eagle Pitcher. And it was critical they make batteries, but they make some of the world's best batteries. And if it weren't for that battery, the crew on Apollo 13 wouldn't have been able to make it home. Those batteries kept that life support system going. And those batteries, proven in that crucible, have persisted. They've been a part of our space, infrastructure since, and they're part of our Artemis program to go back to the moon and go on Mars. And so all I would say is access to space on an individual basis, the connectivity to the communities, to the cultures that really push and drive American ingenuity, for lack of a better term, is what Kelly was saying earlier, I think are really desirable and continue to be desirable. And then I guess I would last say that, there are 3 countries in the world who have human spaceflight capability that they can launch their own humans into space. We're, of course, one of them. The Russian Federation has this capability, and the Chinese. But this morning, when an Indian astronaut entered the International Space Station, yes, that was done certainly by a commercial company and through the ingenuity of Axiom and through SpaceX and others. But it was also the direct result of the heads of state in India and the United States and successive U.S. presidential administrations understanding that this long-term relationship from a political perspective between the United States and India, enormous democracies in the world, has a real tangible value to it. And India is making a bid to become the 4th country in the world with an indigenous human spaceflight capability. Mm-hmm. So it's not by accident that this morning an Indian astronaut entered the International Space Station. So all I would say is that this leadership, when you hear people talk about leadership, ask those questions. Why? What does that mean? What do you get for it? Mm-hmm. But I'm here to tell you, you get a lot for the work that and the investment that you make in America's space program, on the government side, on the commercial side certainly, and frankly on the academic institution side as well. So I'm really grateful, of course, for the panel complexion, so that I can make that nice point and stop talking.
Wonderful.
One more question before open it up to the audience for questions. I think what we've seen here is that the United States has its allies that are cooperating in space. China has its allies for space cooperation. But right now, there's effectively no cooperation between the United States and China in space. Can we see that change? Is there a prospect for changing that? Is there a prospect to have an analogy to what we see up here on the screen of Apollo-Soyuz, of say a Crew Dragon and its Chinese counterpart meeting in space?
I'd certainly welcome Sadia.
Yeah.
Look, I think we need to remain hopeful. I think what we need to look for is lowest common denominators of what is possible in terms of a handshake. I say that one possibility is to think about safeguarding human health, safeguarding human beings in space, and at least begin a dialogue and a conversation around that, because we have some structures. I mean, are we at this 1975 moment? I don't think so just yet, but I think that doesn't mean that we sort of look for pathways forward where we can actually provide some collaboration that may be helpful to any human being that's going into space, irrespective of what country, whether they're commercially or whether it's civil. I think protecting human beings should be the first order of business. And so I put that on the table as a possible pathway forward.
Yeah, I would say from my perspective, and this is very much a crystal ball question, like speculation, but I think that it's inevitable that we are going to get to a place where we're going to have those sort of conversations, particularly if you look at the future planned utilization of space, especially on the moon. Like, so China, plans to have a permanent research base. The United States is going to go back with the Artemis mission. We plan to have infrastructure. There are commercial companies that are landing on the moon to hopefully mine it for in situ resources. And so I just think that from a utilization, integration, proximity perspective, that it's inevitable that something will need to be worked out so it's not completely hostile.
Some minimum dialogue may
Yeah.
be necessary, to sort of move us down that pathway.
Yeah.
Perhaps we're not there yet, but I think that door should be kept open, sort of thinking about what might be possible.
I would just say, from our perspective, this is one of those, in that great vastness of space, we're sometimes grateful for very easy, direct guidance. And so, NASA is legislatively prohibited, and I know Jeff knows this, everybody else knows this, but there's a law that says we can't cooperate with China. So it's really, up to the people in this room and your elected representatives to really help guide us, about what our intention is in space in the future. I think what you hear these fine folks talking about is the practical aspects, and there's certainly, conjunction avoidance. We don't want satellites hitting each other. This concept of non-interference that we've talked about earlier in the Outer Space Treaty is an aspect of that, and you guys were highlighting some of those potential future complexities on the lunar surface in the future. Now, the moon's actually a fairly big place, so I appreciate that it may not be a pressing issue, but if you ever are really interested in I don't know, I find it fascinating presentation. There's a gentleman from NASA named Jake Bleacher who does a presentation on lighting on the moon, or on the navigable pathways, essentially, that are kind of like highways or byways that we think are really the most feasible for utilization on the moon. So even though the moon's big, it certainly, there are some really preferable areas, and that's really what we're focused on. And frankly, we have been challenged by successive administrations to go and be the presence that starts to set the norms and starts to influence the way activities are handled on the moon and in future in the world. So that's a charge that you've all given us at NASA, and one we take incredibly seriously. There are people working every day for that, and starting as soon as February of next year, we have a window open to launch the Artemis II mission. This is the next mission in our campaign for Artemis, and so we couldn't be more excited about it. But we are working really, really hard with our industry partners, with our international partners, to make that happen, to set the tone, to be the one driving the future to look like a future that we in the United States, or we with our close allies and partners, want to see. So,
Great. Time for audience questions. Got someone out there with the microphone, so you want to raise your hand. We'll bring the microphone over.
Heads up, but first though, we're going to turn up the lights, so be prepared for that.
a little brighter in our eyes.
And for our virtual attendees, just type your questions in, whether you're watching on Zoom or YouTube, and we'll try to get some of those as well. I saw a hand up. Adrienne, did you have a question? Okay. We'll go back here. Just be sure to hold the microphone close to your mouth.
Hello, I am wondering if any governments or companies are considering the supplies that may be needed in bulk to go to the people that are working either in data centers or in whatever capacity on the moon. It seems like we haven't, at least in publication, haven't really seen a lot of push towards how are we going to get bulk cargo, say, or bulk resources to the moon. And with frequency, for the people's needs. Is that a possible lowest common denominator, as you were speaking about, like that we could potentially just, break ground with?
Getting supplies to human beings on the moon.
Yes.
Yes, absolutely. Like a ferry service, or imagine an ambulance that could, go. Yeah, so I think, that is certainly something to consider. We don't have to look for the pie in the sky. You just kind of look for the things that, as I keep saying, just anything that safeguards human beings on a different celestial body or in a different environment might be something to think about. And I wanted to say one other thing. I think in the U.S. we think the U.S. has to take charge, has to have an opening. I also urge, the Chinese government to have its own opening and think about how it might want to engage the United States. So this is not going to be a one-way conversation, but there's also a possibility that they may come up with examples like this that might be important to opening a dialogue. So it has to begin like that, I think.
Yeah, I can say there are a lot of commercial companies that are looking at that. Like one in particular, it's called Space Phoenix. It's based out of Baltimore. The way that they're essentially, it's transportation cargo missions.
Nice.
The reason you probably haven't heard about it often is that there's no infrastructure to supply yet.
Yes.
And so when you look about how that ecosystem is going to build out, it is going to be stepping stone. Like we need to have the reliable, routine, cheap rockets first. We need to have the infrastructure that they're bringing things to. We then need to bring the people, and then we can bring the cargo. So it's all being developed, not necessarily in silos, but in tandem. There just hasn't been this coordinated, concentrated effort because there's nothing to engage yet.
Yes. Yeah.
But it is being done.
It's being done.
I might add, there are a lot of companies in the U.S. working on lunar landers, from fairly small ones to versions of SpaceX's Starship. But the European Space Agency has a concept for their own lunar lander called Argonaut. And what their vision is, they would like to offer that to NASA, to Artemis, say, do you need cargo delivery services? We've got a lander for you. Oh, by the way, can you bring one of our astronauts to the moon as well as part of this deal? So another angle for international cooperation.
Wonderful diplomatic exchange, I think.
Yeah.
Right, someone back here had their hand up. Yeah.
Hi, how has the Space Force creation impacted the field of international cooperation in space?
Someone was eavesdropping our
Yes,
conversations in the green room. So
You gave a very good answer in the green room.
I forgot what the answer was. I'm sorry.
It was brilliant. It was brilliant.
Yeah, so easily. I think that there is a whole aspect of space security, concerns about the militarization, weaponization of space, and particularly from the point of view of the United States, because we're so dependent on space in a significant way relative to all other countries in the world, that the Space Force, it's not going out there to sort of do Star Wars. It's there primarily to monitor the safety and stability and tracking the space assets that we have that ensure our national security, including nuclear security. How has it changed the international landscape? So the first thing I think we need to know is that the US was actually not among the first to sort of go down this road. It was in fact catching up to other countries like Russia and China that had more dedicated units with respect to space as well as cyber aspects. And today what we find is that many countries have dedicated space force units. And so the way that that landscape has changed is that we now think of space as a warfighting domain. And we are very interested in the protection and stability and safety and security of space assets, because it not just affects, as Patrick was pointing out, all our civilian and commercial lives, it also affects our national security, including nuclear deterrence. So, yes, yeah. Yeah.
I would also just note, the many astronauts in the world actually served in the military, either previously or actively. And so, the military, of course, is very mission focused. And so when you become a NASA astronaut, even if you're, on detail from one of the uniformed services, you embrace the mission that you have been given. And that mission is peaceful, scientific exploration in space. And so I think it's Missouri native Michael Hopkins, who was actually the first first astronaut to be sworn in as a member of the Space Force, and it happened actually on the International Space Station. And just to really indicate how accepting or unproblematic, if you will, that was. I mean, it happened on the International Space Station in view of our international partners. And Nick Hague, a Kansas boy, is also a Space Force member now. But I had the really incredible experience watching Colonel Hague launch on a Soyuz. And if you all follow space closely, you may know that the first time around it didn't work. And so they had to abort the mission in downrange in Kazakhstan. And there was a moment where we weren't sure what was going to happen. And his family, was there at the launch with us. And so like the very, tangible nature of this issue was in our hands. And it was actually on a Russian rocket, that his life was saved, he was spared. He then launched not long after to the International Space Station, completed his mission. And it's just sort of an incredible story. So again, 2 Space Force representatives executing peaceful engagement for scientific purposes.
We have a question from an online viewer who asks, what do you see as some of the challenges for the next few years in working with our traditional partners, such as the future of the Artemis Accords, in an environment where NASA's budget may be cut?
Well, certainly budgets and the budgets in which we're entrusted help facilitate the missions that we have. I would also just say that the budget proposal that just was released in the last month, it really is also full of really enormous potential opportunities. And again, I'm sorry for going on and on about human spaceflight tonight, because that really is the area in which I'm most engaged. But the tremendous opportunity set put in place by that budget for low Earth orbit, future commercial stations potentially serve as successor to the International Space Station. Those resources are there. That budget priority is there. That guidance and direction is there. And then on the exploration side, I mean, they're really kind of unparalleled numbers, budget support numbers for the Moon to Mars activities that we have. So the Artemis program and executing the first human mission to Mars, they're really prioritized there in a kind of a historic level. So if you're looking for opportunities to work with NASA and you happen to be a representative of a foreign or international space agency, the opportunity set is really there. It's really high. Really, this was about, a focusing of particular priorities. And so, again, Jeff, I don't know, you must be in my meetings too, but, Jeff's talking about our traditional partners. I would say the message from NASA, from the leadership, from the White House and from Congress is that we want to deepen those relationships that we have had traditionally, and we want to actually find ways to expand those relationships as well, because the newcomers, we talked about India earlier, that's really exciting, but there are new players all over the world that are really interested in working with the United States. And so those opportunities are gonna be there, and we're just hoping that we can meet the opportunity and meet the challenge.
All right, I saw, I've got a couple hands up over here. Coming up behind you, sir.
Oh. Yeah, thank you. It's been very interesting. When you talk about stability and security, everybody having those interests, it almost to me suggests somebody's also thinking of ownership. And I just wonder if there's things that are going on as to, okay, you get this quadrant of the moon and we get that quadrant, and you have this space corridor for your ships to go back and forth in, and you fly your satellites at this altitude. Are those type of things going on, and who's doing them?
You want to start?
Yes, let me, I will give you a very legal answer. This goes back to the 1967 Outer Space Treaty, which prohibits any kind of appropriation, any kind of national appropriation of space. So whether on the moon or in orbit, it just doesn't allow that. And so for most of the countries that are part of the Outer Space Treaty, that are signatories to the treaty, nobody can sort of claim this is our quadrant and you can move away. You have to move out of that. So, yeah.
Yeah.
So that's the legal theory. That's the legal reality. But
I think it goes again to that point I made about the practical eventuality that we're moving into, because just taking the moon as the landscape, there's already been 2 private companies, U.S. companies that have landed on the moon, Firefly Aerospace and Intuitive Machines, both out of Texas. And then a Japanese company, iSpace, almost did. They crash landed on the moon, but they have really ambitious lunar missions. So I think that the eventuality we're moving into from a commercial aspect, it does call into question what that looks like. And then I think beyond that, it's the standards of then how you engage in those environments. Because if you think about one of the really interesting areas for the moon for a lot of these companies is because of the natural resources it has to potentially mine. But whose standards are the right mining standards? And how far do you go? And there's no good answer to that yet. So there's a lot of conversations happening about what that eventuality looks like, but there's no right answer now.
I mean, I think one thing I will add is that we have the Artemis Accords, which are really principles about how we should be behaving in space. And it's tethered to the Outer Space Treaty, but it has this idea of safety zones around space operations. And so when it first came out, when the Artemis Accords first came out, it became very controversial internationally because people thought the US is saying we're going to set up these safety zones and that's going to be sort of a US-led block and what have you. But that is not the position of the US government, but I think Kelly is absolutely correct. We do have to start rethinking some of the premises by which we are interpreting Article 2 of the Outer Space Treaty, which is about national appropriation, because we're up at the limits of what is possible just parsing it legally and interpreting it legally. Sooner or later, we have to deal with the practicalities on the ground, and we are not there yet.
Yeah.
So that, I think, I wonder if that's also a dialogue area.
Yeah.
I don't know, something to think about. Yeah.
Are there any agreements in place to safeguard the 6 Apollo landing sites?
The heritage sites.
The heritage sites. I mean, no, go ahead. No, you're the NASA person.
No.
It's your site.
So these are, for really, and it's kind of a combination with the last question. It's, this is why there's such an impetus from our perspective to get to the moon, to, if you will, have our activities, which we're going to be very transparent about. We're going to make sure everybody knows where we're going, when we're going, and please, if you can, don't interfere or do anything to harm the activities that we have there. And so we're interested in trying to make sure that when we get to the moon, it's in a place of our choosing and that we're able to operate in the way that is not constrained by other limitations, like our commitment to not interfere with other countries and their activities. So I know heritage sites on the moon is very important, but I don't think we've got any binding sort of treaties to that effect.
We don't have binding, but I think under our present space law regime, we don't also, no government, there's no theory of abandoning anything that you own. So technically, the state continues to have authority and supervise the authority over whatever and responsibility for what it has put up there. And on that basis, you don't want any harmful interference with those things. Again, I think that this has not been, with the private companies coming in, with these heritage sites in place, I do think we need to begin to think a little bit more clearly about how you would want to provide protection and security for those things that we're putting into place.
And one practical thing that occurs as well is, the arena, and what's one of the big distinctions between Artemis and Apollo is our focus is on the lunar south pole. And those Apollo missions were at the equator. And so, the geography is distinct. And so while there, of course, is this potential, and hopefully there is a huge influx of activity there, it'll hopefully be, somewhat practically in a different place.
All right, we're a little past our time limit. You've got a question. We got one more question up here, and let's make this the last question.
I will say that I have a question about China because we brought 5 China visitors through here on Saturday, high officials, and they came for a 1.5-hour tour, and they'd never heard of Linda Hall Library. But they were fascinated, and they're making inquiry. That's not my question. But if you'll stay after, I would visit with anybody that wants to talk about it from the panel. My question is, you talk a lot about space travel, human travel. Linda Hall Library has been very good in recent years in bringing in astronomy and other types of exploration that I believe has been shared largely with everybody, including Chinese, including Russia. Most of that is made available, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, we call the concept open science.
Yeah, which is wonderful. To what extent is your work shared, even without being targeted for military purposes, with those who are not currently in collaboration? I'm asking it from a Chinese standpoint because we have a lot of Chinese that come through here, and they're very interested in that.
Well, at the risk of suggesting it's distinct, but there's been a lot of discussion today about regulatory circumstances here in the United States. One of the reasons there is a robust regulatory regime in the United States is for export control reasons. The United States is the world's leader in these engineering technologies that enable all of these incredible things that we've been talking about tonight. But the technical know-how, the engineering design, the intellectual property here in the United States that enables us to do that, along with the entrepreneurial spirit and other things like that, is a national asset, and it's one that we have to safeguard. One of the tenets, and of course I didn't want to bore everybody to sleep tonight, but it's a fundamental tenet of the international cooperation that we have at NASA is to make sure that there are appropriate technology safeguards in place. Whether that is limiting access to things at the interface, so that they don't even a partner that we have had longstanding relationship with doesn't have a detailed understanding of how our system design works or how it functions, so that they couldn't necessarily reproduce it or replicate it on their own. And the reason we do that is in large part because that is a sure or a better way to try to help ensure that these partners of ours don't become, sort of a soft target, if you will, for sort of nefarious action. So we do a lot of work to try to protect against it. Of course, it's not a perfect space, but it's a top of mind issue for us, because part of maintaining our leading position is maintaining that technological advantage that we want to keep here at home.
I have to self-correct myself. They came through on Friday. They were here for the dragon boat races on Saturday. They're from the international group in China that goes around the world on dragon boat races.
That's cool.
All right, thank you very much for a wonderful and insightful conversation. Thank you, Jeff, Sadia, Kelly, Patrick.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
And thank you, everyone, for attending tonight's program. We hope to see you back here for one of our Linda Hall Library events or at an International Relations Council event. Thank you, and have a great evening. I think the rain has stopped, so you're in luck.